Our next session, we have not one but two speakers. We have Alison Kelly, a farm emissions specialist with Agriculture Victoria, and Joe Bear from Bear and Twig, and I think nearly everyone knows Joe. Alison has over 20 years' experience in national leadership positions within the Australian agriculture sector. She is currently working as the Farm Emissions Specialist with Agriculture Victoria, leading a small but high impact, I love that, a small but high impact team working directly with Victorian farmers to know, understand and act on their emissions. And of course, Joe, with her husband Greg, runs over 5,000 merino ewes at Loddonvale to produce both a self-replacing flock and first cross ewe lambs. And they're very centred on regenerative agriculture and holistic management, and consider their sheep being a vital tool for positive environmental change. So please welcome Alison and Joe to talk about farmer perspectives, know, understand and act to reduce on-farm emissions. So I'm handing over to you two. You're going to incorporate questions in this session so I can have a rest. Okay.
Thanks all, and it's really great that we've got a program that's led really well to this presentation that Joe and myself are going to give this morning. So the key here is that we're delving into emissions. So obviously the topic around natural capital and how that fits in, this is one element of how we're addressing that with farmers. But I guess the key element we're wanting to get across today is how it makes sense at the farm scale. So the project that we've been delivering through Agriculture Victoria is the On-Farm Emissions Action Plan pilot. It's currently underway. I still use the disclaimer, it is a pilot for that reason. We're learning as we go, and we've got wonderful people like Joe who are also learning with us, and many others in the room if they wanted to mention that they're part of the pilot as well as team members here today. So I'd also like to just start with a video from one of our very first farm participants that has gone through the pilot, just to give a little bit of an overview of the pilot itself in his own words.
My name is Julian Carroll. We're in Mudgegonga in northeast Victoria. We're on the family farm here, which is a commercial beef enterprise, about 700 acres. So the project we've implemented as part of our emissions reduction action plan is to improve our feeding systems. So what we've done is we've taken our existing stock containment areas and made a more efficient way of feeding cattle. Stock containment areas like we've got here are designed to get cattle out of your paddocks when there's no need for them to be in there because there's no feed in there. In a tough season, at the beginning of autumn or in a drought, you don't want your cattle degrading already stressed pastures. So the way we use them is we've got our cattle in here until they're ready to eat grass straight out of the paddock. This particular feeding system makes sure that we can replicate our experiences of the good years, which is early growth in young cattle.
The feeding system that Julian's undertaken here really makes his operation very efficient and ready to implement feed additives that will help reduce his emissions when they become more available and more adoptable into agricultural systems.
We can see in our emissions footprint that enteric emissions are the biggest aspect that we can work on and to achieve some improvements. For us, it's about maximising productivity, making sure we hit our target markets as early as possible or reduce wastage by having better reproductive outcomes. In your mind, sometimes a project is bigger than it really is, and this was actually really straightforward to do. Really all we needed to do was get a good gravel base down, drop in the feed troughs, build the cattle cable front and upgrade our feeding wagon, and cattle look really good for it. 9 out of 10 years we'll just be feeding our homemade silage. So we've gone for a machine that is very specifically designed just to chop up a bale of silage and elevate that into the feed bunks. The obvious other consideration would have been a mixing wagon, but that would have cost us about an extra hour a day in preparing that ration. The beauty of using concrete feed bunks too is that when we do have one of those years where we have to import concentrates like grains or pellets, we've got infrastructure ready to go. And also we're feed additive ready. If it turns out that down the track we have a practical solution for putting supplements in to reduce enteric emissions. We've been really impressed at how quickly the cattle adapted to eating out of a feed bunk. Within 2 minutes, before it got to the end of the feed out line, they were all heads through the wire and munching away. The feed use efficiency is fantastic. The cattle are eating absolutely everything we feed them. In good years, we can get a much faster turn off of our steers. And what we're trying to do with our feeding infrastructure is to use management and control in those poorer times to make sure we still achieve great growth rates. So if our feeder steer turn off can vary up to a month or even 6 weeks, depending on seasonal conditions, for every 2 weeks we bring forward our turn off of a B double load of steers, we drop 13 tonnes of CO2 emissions out of our system. So 26 tonnes of reduced emissions if we bring forward our date by a month. Every farm's different in the way they're set up and their propensity to feed cattle, but this is certainly a really great way to feed cattle with minimal hours a day and maximum feed efficiency.
So as I mentioned, Julian is one of our farm participants in the On-Farm Emissions Action Plan pilot and was our first participant to go through to the grants process. So our project involves both a one-on-one visit and a farm emissions profile that happens with a colleague, with a staff member through either Agriculture Victoria or service providers, and then following up with an on-farm grant that they're able to access to implement an action that we've described within their emissions reduction action plan. So we're working with 250 farms across Victoria, and there's a list of the industries that we're actually working with and the number of participants across the state. Sorry that the graph's not very useful for seeing where they're all located, but we've tried to hit a diversity of participants across different regions, across different industry groups and farming systems, but also working with participants that are really interested in working with us. So understanding their own emissions, going through the process with us to know and understand and then to act on their own emissions. So we've got, as I said, about 250 participants so far, and we're working our way about halfway through getting their action plans through. And so one of our other participants that we've been working with is Jo, and I'd like to hand over to her to just give a little bit of an overview about what it meant for you to be involved in the project, a little bit about your farm and your emissions number, if you'd be willing to talk about it.
Thanks, Alison. As Kerry introduced, we're on the lower Loddon River floodplains of Canary Island, which is sort of near Boort, near Kerrang, and we run around 5,000 merino ewes. And most of our farm is natural vegetation. We've got around 100 hectares of irrigation as well. So after the millennial drought, we really focused on holistic grazing management practices, and as Kerry said, we use sheep as a tool to improve our landscape. Part of that holistic management talks about the importance of people, so we've really focused on people, and our big thing is curiosity and really learning all the time and welcoming diversity into our business. And we've, over the last 20 years, have come with some really great opportunities with that approach, and we welcome lots of people on our farm, and we really value what we learn from other people. So why did we get involved in this emissions project? I suppose, and Katie touched on it right at the start, I think as a farming community there's so much noise about carbon farming or carbon emissions. A lot of that noise is negative, and it's really hard to get really accurate information about what we should be doing, what should we be focusing on. And the reality is we're going to, the whole world has said we've got to be carbon neutral by 2050. So we can't be left behind, and we didn't want to be left behind. I also wanted to get some carbon literacy. I just wanted to know what things meant. And so I thought, gosh, what better way than having your own farm business measured and having someone come to your farm and talk to you one-on-one about what impacts our farming practices have had is just amazing. I think the other thing is Agricultural Victoria is a really trusted organisation in Victoria. They've been around for a very long time and they provide reliable and up-to-date information. So I think we really trusted working with Agriculture Victoria. The other part of this project is that we get to meet our other peers, our other farming businesses that are involved in this program, and that's really great too. We all know as farmers how much we learn by talking to other farmers, so that's been really great. We want to know how we stack up. You know, we think we've got this environmental bent, but really does that stack up at the end of the game? So we'll have a look at that. And then, of course, we're pretty opportunity focused. What are the opportunities we've got to follow up with as we go forward? We want it to be attractive for our children, and I think this space is a really important space for the next generation. I think that's about it. Alison?
Yeah, so I guess we'll hear from Jo again. Sorry, that was the end of Jo's story. So we've had multiple participants go through the project so far, and that was just one perspective. But we know that there's multiple starting points from where people are at in terms of this space. And so the things we were hearing is not just around the markets and what can I do about those markets, but even just where do I start? You know, what is my number? And as Jo said, like, how do I stack up, and how is that benchmark against what industry is doing, and what are the potential sources of emissions and potential opportunities and sinks. We then had others that might have been a little bit further on the journey. Maybe they have done something that is around an emissions footprint or have their number before, but really then stuck with what to do next. Like, what is their next decision? How do they make a decision on which action is best placed for them and for now? And what are some realistic goals? Setting that up with them, thinking about where they want to go, how it fits in with their business, and going from there. So that's sort of our framework where we've talked about it, that know, understand and act, and everyone that we've worked with is somewhere on that journey that we've been going through. So where we start when we go and talk to individual farmers is that we actually ask for them to provide some of their data before we even come out on farm. So we send out a data request form in advance. We fill them out into a carbon footprinting tool, and we bring out an infographic that starts to make sense of those emissions, their emissions on the farm. So we start with the emission sources. So we talk about where it's multiple different greenhouse gases and the processes that are happening on farm to generate enteric methane, nitrous oxide and carbon dioxide. And then we also talk about the sources at the sinks on their farm as well. So whether or not trees and soils on their property and the extent and condition like we heard about this morning. And all over we talk about that as their scope 1 and 2 emissions. And we've heard a little bit of this terminology today, but we talk about that being the farm boundary. So those emissions and sinks that you are in direct control of. We then also talk about scope 3, and again, that's that terminology where we're talking about it being beyond the farm gate, and someone being someone else's scope 3, and how you can actually start to begin to address that, and how all of those come together to actually generate your net farm footprint or emissions estimate. And I guess that's the key point here, is we're not going out there with technology to measure emissions at point source. We are doing this as an estimate, as an outline of what potential is. So before starting, know what you're trying to do this for and which tools people are using to be able to understand that. Choose the most appropriate approach, and we've gone with the University of Melbourne Greenhouse Gas Accounting Framework tools as a result of that. Ensure that you have the appropriate data and records, and making sure that you're seeking advice on that too. And that final point around this being an estimate, we always do give that disclaimer that something's going to be generally right but specifically wrong for their farm. But I guess the benefit we have with going out and speaking to them one-on-one is that we can explain those nuances and really get to the levers and what is the detail within that estimate that we can get through. So if you haven't started on this journey so far, or if you're thinking about calculating your own number, the data and records that are going to be required into these accounting tools are ones that you are familiar with, and they're up there on the slide now. So they're both the input data and the output data, so the production from your system, whether that be meat or wool or some other product that's coming off the farm, and understanding each of those in a lot more detail. And if you are a livestock business, there's quite a number of pieces of information to be provided around livestock and the numbers on farm, as well as then the extent of other inputs that you might bring. So collecting those farm records, using a calculator, and there are a number of calculators out there already, some of them free, some of them subscription, some of them online, some of them downloadable. I've put a link to just the one which is the free downloadable Excel-based tools, which are through the University of Melbourne site there, which are the ones that we're using, except for in dairy. And then understanding your number is the very next step. And to take a point here, what that means is both looking at the results that you're getting from that estimate, but having a chance to perhaps look at what others are doing within the industry. And there are benchmarks that exist, some of those a little bit more robust than others, depending on how far advanced the industry is in collecting that data and reporting it publicly. But I've put up here that either through the industry sustainability frameworks, where is one location where you can perhaps even get a benchmark for an emissions intensity figure, which is the emissions per unit of output that you've developed as part of the farming system, or things like the farm monitor programs, which actually have been collecting data over multiple years and actually allocating that to greenhouse gas emissions for both the dairy and the livestock sector. I've included on the slide here the dairy benchmarking data set that Dairy Australia recently put out, which shows how emissions are allocated to both meat and milk, which are the two products from a dairy system, and how actually the industry at the moment from all of those data sets historically are actually tracking at the moment. Those bell curves show where they're landing in that emissions intensity figure. So when we go out on farm, we circle where they're at. We actually do have, for dairy, regional figures as well that we can also then circle how they're fitting within those regional figures. And then again, a disclaimer to make sure you're comparing apples with apples and making sure that you're understanding what those data sets are based on. So that's part of what we've done as part of understanding and knowing your number. And then we work out what are the other levers that are actually driving those emissions. If that emissions intensity is outside of the industry benchmark, why is that? What do we think is happening in your system? Is your system not a typical year for some reason? Were there annual considerations that need to be taken into consideration? Was your business in growth phase, for example, and you're holding on to more animals than you would have for any other year, and things like that? We work through that. We talk about then efficiencies, and I think this is, was a really interesting point about the double dividend kind of value here, which is if there are efficiencies to be gained, they'll also have a benefit for emissions reduction in most instances as well. So that's where we start. We start with a self-reflection on where there might be some efficiencies in your system, whether they relate to your animals, whether they relate to your input use, and whether or not there's other alternative systems or products that could be utilised as part of that as well. And I guess that's quite a lot to sort of go through in one instance. With these one-on-one sessions that we run often go for 3 to 4 hours or longer if people are willing to talk. And we sort of say there's no stupid questions as part of that going through. And one of the things that we really do talk about is coming to these one-on-one farm visits with, we can bring the emissions information, but you can bring your farming systems information, and we can start to talk about how good business management is good carbon management. And so I guess just from Jo's perspective, it'd be really great to see what her thinks the feelings are around this point around, do you believe that good carbon management is good business management?
We're going pretty well here with this tag team.
Don't jinx us.
The double dipping that Alison talked about was very clear in the results that we got. Really, as sheep producers, we've identified increasing turnover as one of our key elements that we focus as a business. But actually, when we talked about our carbon emissions footprint, then that was also a key element. Getting our turnover quick, producing more lambs, so having a high reproduction rate, selling our lambs early, which means having really productive, more perennial-based pastures, and having flexible stock numbers, which I thought was really cool. That sort of fits with our natural capital accounting figures with that Farm 3. I think that's a really important one as well. So our core breeding stock maybe would be reduced and we'd have more trade sheep. And then also your genetics, looking at early maturing sheep maybe more. So that's got benefits for both carbon and also good farming practice. Maintaining ground cover is really important. And it's just also reinforced the idea of keeping better farm records, which I know is really boring. I think we all don't like it. We use AgriWeb. That's been really great for us to keep account of our sheep numbers as well as chemical use. And then our tree plantings, that's been really good. And because we've also done the natural capital accounting program, I think that idea, especially where we're from in northwest Victoria, that shade and the shelter belts is really crucial for us as well. So that fits nicely with the two projects.
So I guess in terms of then thinking through our logic of we've now come on the farm visit, we've been able to provide a little bit of an outline of an emissions profile, perhaps even validating that on the farm visit and collecting a little bit more data. Agriculture Victoria and our service providers go away and we actually develop up an action plan. So these action plans actually describe what is possible to do now to reduce emissions, and we talk about it as opportunities within the action table, but it's sort of highlighted by this diagram which we've got up on the slide here around multiple pathways that lead towards net zero or carbon neutral if that is the goal. And so we, as I said in the prior component, we actually do talk about emissions efficiency, and so where there's opportunities to reduce an emissions intensity number, and that might be looking at improving your data and record keeping to be able to get that to a robust number that you're really comfortable with. It could be considering other approaches that might be possible for further efficiency gains going forward, and we talk about them being the 1 to 2%ers on the farm. So the do now, no regrets kind of opportunities where we can target some additional efficiency actions. We then talk about the sort of medium to longer term opportunities for reducing absolute emissions. And I guess we sort of saw a little bit of that thinking in Julian Carroll's video where he talked about both doing a bit more work around efficiencies of feed out, but thinking about being feed additive ready in the longer term. So at the moment, perhaps those feed additives that will address enteric methane might not necessarily be available for his farming system right now, but if and when they do become feasible or economic to implement, he'd be able to be ready to look at those and reduce his absolute enteric methane emissions down further. We heard Kate talk about the terminology around insetting or offsetting. I guess, the key component here is really talking about the landscape and what the landscape is sequestering in terms of carbon. Hopefully we're talking about that within the farm scale at this point rather than perhaps looking at offsets. But again, that's obviously something that's part of the business decision making. And then the final point is around looking at the existing carbon stocks and make sure that you're protecting and maintaining those over time as well. And then when we think about those in terms of that overall footprint, how do these relate to actual actions that are possible on farm? So thinking about the scope 3, so those purchases and the beyond emissions, we talk about opportunities where there might be the ability to reduce inputs from supplementary feed or purchase feed via the maximisation of homegrown feed. Or there could be questions that we need to ask our suppliers around whether or not their product that they're providing is actually an alternative product that might have a lower emissions footprint associated with it, and looking at when those might be available into the longer term. For livestock and enteric methane, we do talk about the 1 to 2%ers around herd and reproductive efficiencies, whether they're already maximising the opportunities through genetics, and the identification of unproductive animals and making sure that they're identified quickly and off the system as quickly as possible, and improve feed systems as we saw with Julian's, and the final point around becoming feed additive ready. For those systems that might have manure management, we're probably talking more around dairy systems or intensive systems at this point in time, but we do delve into the opportunities around effluent design, reuse of nutrients back on farm, as well as whether or not there's other mechanical improvements that could be done to reduce any methane from the manure itself. And nitrous oxide is another input into the system, so whether or not there's opportunities to reduce the overall use of that through right time, right place, right application and right products, or alternative products, if that might be opportunities there. And the final source of emissions around carbon dioxide, we are talking about those in the form of energy, lime and urea, whether or not an energy audit has happened already or whether that's an opportunity on farm, and then maximising any energy that you are using as efficiently as possible, whether renewables are part of the system or there's further opportunity for expanding that, and then obviously into the future whether electric vehicles and machinery might be able to replace existing vehicles and equipment over time. So the flip side, talked about the sources of emissions. We also talk about the sinks as well. And regarding trees and soil carbon, I guess the key point we talk here is around the long-term stock of carbon on the farm. So we talk about the opportunities through markets. Sorry, it's just got a mind of its own there. Talking about markets being an income stream when carbon is in an accumulation phase. So it is dependent on the age of the trees and the existing farm management practices that are being applied to the soil, and whether or not there's further room to move to increase that over time, and talk about additional sequestration here. So whether there's additional room for vegetation in the form of trees or forestry planting, soil benchmarking, and then overall whole farm planning in the mix there as well. So that's a little bit of a guide into some of the interventions that we've been seeing so far as part of our projects. But yeah, I'd like to get Jo back to have a bit of a talk about her project and what she's actually implementing on her farm too.
Thanks, Alison. So the action plan, we got some funding to implement the action plan. The key element of that is that we have 6 months to actually implement what we propose to do. So that limited the amount of things that we could look at. Probably the key things, I heard Cam Nicholson talk, and he said, you know, really focusing on your sheep production side and getting more efficient at that is a really good thing to be doing. And then your carbon sink of tree planting is bonus on top of that. So probably long term, we're going to continue to look at being much more efficient sheep producers is the key one. For our action plan, actually, outside of action plan, we did do soil testing as well. So we're going to actually do that over the next 5 years and try and test all our paddocks, as I think is a really good way of monitoring what's going on there. But the two elements that we've done for our action plan grant is that we recognise that we've still got quite a lot of, we've got areas of river frontage, creek frontage, and a few dams that are still being accessed by stock. So we wanted to reduce the effluent, the erosion, and increase biodiversity by fencing those off. And we've actually installing a reticulated stock water system on there. So we'll use 2-inch pipe, troughs and then tanks for that. And then the second one was more tree planting. And probably for our area, and I didn't realise that we've got a long-standing knowledge about tree planting. I've grown up with a family that's planted lots of trees, but our whole region, we've got some excellent tree native nurseries. We've come across a really good tree planting contractor. And we've also linked with our local Barappa mob who assist us with planting trees, and they can get back to country. So that's our big plan for probably the next 5 to 10 years. We've, worked out areas that we want to plant. So we want to focus on the westerly aspects of our property, northwest aspects. We've got neighbours who have already done planting, so we want to link with them to do environmental corridors, plan along our creeks, depressions, and then also have them big enough to be able to be a grazing paddock once the trees and shrubs have got big enough. So that's our aims for that. So we're going to start planting very soon.
You're the next one as well, just to talk about co-benefits as well.
Oh, my co-benefits, yeah. So thank you. I'd forget to look on there. We're planning how many? 71 hectares. Oh, no, that's current. Yeah, I was going to say 7. So we're just planting 7 hectares in July with trees and shrubs. It's mainly going to be a black box, woody grassland vegetation class is our plan. But yeah, as I mentioned before, the co-benefits, biodiversity, reduce erosion, shade, shelter, animal health, it just goes on. And I think that's the exciting thing about natural capital too. It's actually all the pollinators, our predators and all these other aspects as well. And also that link with our Barappa, that's been a really life-changing thing, that they've been able to come back to country and work with us, and that's been just really special. Thanks, Alison. And you're going to explain how it adds.
Yeah, that's great. So we're probably getting a bit tighter on time, but I guess the workings down the bottom there are just the estimates that we've provided around the sequestration benefits. So the final point, we haven't put numbers around all those other co-benefits for full disclaimer, but I guess just showing how the additional 7 hectares adds to the value of both the tree area on the property as a proportion of the farm, but also the sequestration rate overall, therefore showing it's again about a 2% emissions impact with the sequestration component there inset. So I guess, the one-on-one approach that we've been using within the pilot is one example, and we use that as our opportunity to demystify that this is a complex topic and make sense of this at the farm scale. What we are seeing is that different starting point coming out, but focusing back on the knowing and understanding it within your own system is a useful component to what we've been delivering. And what it's also been showing, though, in the reverse is that there is concern about the gap in solutions that might be available right now, readily available for farming systems. And I guess one of the quotes there that's up on the left is the one that speaks to that a little bit more, which is, we've got a long way to go. We thought we were right up there as environmentally sustainable in the top 20% of farmers, but we have no hope of becoming carbon neutral at this rate. So we're trying to address that through the conversations that we're having as part of this, that there are still those co-benefits, those other benefits, but an emissions number is one number in that whole scheme of thinking about the sustainability of the farm overall, but also that we're all part of an industry system that's trying to grapple with this, find all the solutions that are available, make sure that they're cost effective and feasible and available into the longer term. And so I guess part of that is acting together. And the final point I'll just make here is that as part of the acting is not just around reducing emissions and carbon sequestration on the farm itself, but also teaming up and actively engaging with industries and your suppliers and advisors and helping to accelerate these opportunities so that they are more readily available for the whole system. And I know, Jo, you mentioned it as a bit of the sort of boring key message, but the final point here around ensure you put in place good record keeping, because we are finding as well that the data and the records that are acquired into these are still sometimes a barrier for some. There are some default values that we're able to use to generate emissions estimates, but your number, to make sense for you and to be able to track any change that you've done over time, is going to need to be important, and over time will come even more so. So just to recap, from us is just, start with knowing your own number if you haven't already done that, and seeking some advice and help. As I said, there's not just the downloadable, but there's also some industry available tools that are available through the University of Melbourne website as one place, but we can help out if you wanted to get in touch with the AgVic team. We can help point you in the right direction. Look for emissions goals that suit you now and suit your business, and make sure that you are benchmarking yourself and collecting data so that you can track progress around this, because that's also what markets and investors are interested in seeing. Those farm records, bit of a broken record on the farm records now and ongoing, and make sure that you're comparing yourself to yourself. So we are seeing, some people that are including sequestration, some that aren't. There's numbers floating around. Just make sure you ask the right questions and that you're comparing yourself accurately. And then access to resources. We've got a couple on the AgVic site, stand outside, but the sort of know, understand and act brochures, as well as I think we've got a flyer around the top 10 questions to ask before selling your carbon as well. So we've got a couple of those sorts of things floating around as well. That's the key point here, and happy to open it up to some questions, Jo, unless you've got any final points we missed. No. Yeah.
I actually forgot to mention about these boring farm records. I think doing that actually then really honed in about what the key records you need to do your carbon emissions. So if you don't do anything, just do those ones probably.
And yeah, open to having some questions from the floor.
We've got one from online that we'll start with.
Okay.
So in regards to carbon sequestration actions or your greenhouse reducing actions, how does tree planting stack up against other options?
Yeah, so we've probably got, there's probably 2 points as part of our project is, as Joe said, our focus has been on actions that are possible to do now. So by default, things like tree plantings are good opportunities for some where they might have already done all of those efficiency gains and they are working hard and have quite a productive system that they then focus on either trees or soil benchmarking as opportunities that are there. I guess it's also one that's a longer term action too. So it's planning for a market that is going to value that over time. And so even planting now, knowing that in the 5 to 10 year times when those trees are in that accumulation phase I talked about, are going to be most actively sequestering as much carbon as they can. So it is both a do now action, but one that helps them in the long term. So it's a bit of a win-win there, I guess. Yeah.
Just a quick question. We've been talking about concepts so far. I'm a farmer and life's full of things when things go bad. So February the 13th, we had a lightning strike in the Grampians and they came out and it took out, I finished up with 150 hectares, took out 60 hectares of remnant vegetation. I'm not involved in ACU, all right? At this point, after being burnt out, having to shift 3,000 lambs away from front of fire, going 40 degrees, if I had been involved in ACU, would I have been then charged for the carbon lost? Or now is it an opportunity to get in because that 60 hectares is beard table black, half the trees are dead, is now an opportunity to get in on it?
Yeah, so to your first point, I think if you did have a contract through that component, there would be definitely a discussion about where those trees are either going to be replanted or how that actually plays out into the life of your contract. So it does depend on what was signed up. So is it a 10-year, a 25-year, and the requirements there? But I guess fire is also built into the carbon sequestration payments that you're already eligible for. So there's a buffer already put into the whole system to account for some fire loss. But it's more about the reversal that's happened that you've asked about. And in that sense, I don't believe you would be paying for the reversal, but there might be an expectation to make sure that at least there's some replanting. I think there are very active conversations about that. I'm not sure what's happened I think there were some actual farms that were involved in projects and are seeking that advice of what actually needs to happen. So the who pays, I'm not sure, but the who's required to do and the expectation.
Well, I did ask that question of your department after being burnt out, and I haven't got an answer yet.
Yep.
I'm just putting out, there's things out there, and I can tell you I won't be involved because of the mental health related issues that would come from that. It was bad enough trying to I had to shift 2,000 sheep immediately. You want to try shifting 3,000 lambs in 40 degrees when you can't see that screen.
Yep.
And to come back and say, by the way, and I've got no assistance so far from anyone, and to come back and say, no, we'll charge you for that, that's not worth the effort on my behalf.
Yeah, and I guess these are part of the conversations that are needed to be had about risk before being involved in these projects. And I think our colleague Graham has said it before as well, which is like anything where you're actually signing a contract to be involved in something does require you to have legal advice before you're getting in, then you might want to think twice about how you get involved in that. So, but specifically that program is a contractual arrangement that you've gotten into for the credit that you're getting involved with. So yes, agreed.
I'll just start my question maybe. My question's of Jo, Alison, if you want to let her take the mic.
There you are.
Yeah, sorry. You should know my voice by now, Jo. Jo, with regards to your trees and the things you're doing, I know we talked about earlier this morning and I guess also kind of just mentioned there the mental health kind of component. all the things you're doing from a tree perspective and waterways, how is that helping both yourself and Greg from a mental health or wanting to be in that area and continue to be on farm, and maybe how other people are enjoying that space with you now?
Yeah, I think everyone would agree that having trees around, having waterways, we've created a wetland, but my parents created a wetland around the millennial drought. I think the millennial drought for us, we were, in our early 30s then, and we were fortunate to still have some water around us. I think that makes a huge difference. It's just that oasis. So, yeah, I think for all of us, we all agree how many people you see go camping on the river on long weekends. I just think... And I suppose for Greg and I, we just feel so grateful that we have got that opportunity, that we have land we have the opportunity to have, quiet places on the river and the opportunity to plant trees. We're just so grateful for that, because we know there's not very many people who have that opportunity. So that in itself, just being grateful for something is enough. But then being able to walk in there and, that's just amazing too. So, yeah.
I've got another question over this side of the room. Hello. Not finding farm records all that boring. I've got a question about, firstly to Joe, you said you're using AgriWeb. Has that helped you to collect the data you needed for this particular project? Has it got the capability to collect the data you need to be able to report easily? So that's the first part of my question. The second part of my question would be to AgVic, given that you've done this project and you've done, the farm monitor over years and years and years, you must have standardised abilities now to collect data. Is it time now that we start talking to the AgriWebs of the world and the Ag360s, etc., to start to create these tools that the farmers can be using so it's easier for them to collect data and report it multiple times?
Yeah, so AgriWeb is much more of stock movement, and then being able to calculate, your weight of your sheep when you sell them. So that's really good, but you're right, it doesn't give you all those. So I've created spreadsheets for my, I'm gone a blank, but, for all the other things that I need that AgVic asked me to have when we were doing that. So, yeah, so you're right. I think there's Mobile too that someone recommended as well in that space. But you're right, Ange, it's much more of a stock movement, how long have they been in all the paddocks, and then also the weights of animals. That's been really good. And I think you're exactly right, is to be able to have something on an app on your phone that you can just link into rather than wait till night time, because at night time we know we're all too tired. That's a really beneficial thing.
And I'll just, so quick point around the data collection and multiple conversations, collaborations. There's acknowledgement at the federal government level around some data standardisation and a frameworks around that that's just recently come out. So I can see that happening over time. And there is already one online tool, which is the Ag Innovation Australia tool, which was originally set up to try and then link in to those apps like AgriWeb, and I believe is starting to try and set up some APIs to be able to drag in data for easier collection. I guess one thing the reason why we went with Excel-based is then it's owned by our farm participants, not by AgVic. That's the point. So we were able to download it, have a version control we could hold. We knew what went in. We could see the black box behind. So there's probably a couple of conversations there to draw out. But yes, there's some national standardisation coming, I believe. So
thank you.
First step.